Good morning, or I guess good afternoon, everyone, from the Yellow Farmhouse Education Center, and welcome to the final day of KojiCon. I can't quite believe that this day is here. It's been a pretty unbelievable ride to get here, and it's been really, really fun and really informative and educational and exciting. And so I thank you all for being part of it. As a reminder, my name is Jen Rothman, and I'm sure very tired of hearing this, but I'm the director of the Yellow Farmhouse Education Center. For those of you who are new today, watching this session for the first time, the Yellow Farmhouse Education Center is a nonprofit based in southeastern Connecticut. Our mission is to connect people to each other and to where their food comes from through food and farm-based education. So that looks like cooking classes for kids as young as 3 years old through adulthood. We do a lot of teacher professional development. We do a lot of school visits and school trips. Curriculum development and programs like this, which we're thrilled to be able to host. I've been really excited about this session, partly because Jeremy is such an amazing teacher, but also I'm really intrigued by the idea of vegetable charcuterie, especially using koji. And so let me do a quick introduction and then bring him on. Jeremy is the chef owner of Larder, curated delicatessen and bakery in Cleveland, Ohio, nominated by the James Beard Foundation as the best new restaurant in America in 2019. He has been featured in numerous publications like Bon Appetit and Savoir, and was named the Deli Prophet by Food and Wine in the March 2019 Makers issue. Jeremy's also co-host of this entire conference with Rich Shee. Of course, he's the co-author of Koji Alchemy, and his restaurant Larder is also a generous supporter of KojiCon, as is Certified Angus Beef, who has sponsored this session. So let's welcome Jeremy into the stream. I see him sort of there.
I'm here.
He's there. Okay. We see his amazing larder. You've had a bit of a morning, so
Yeah, just a little bit, but
just a little bit.
it's going. My little one spilled water on my laptop a few days ago, and it was working, and now it's not.
It's what happens, and of course that's going to happen right at 11:30 or 10:30. It's 11:30 there or 10:30 there.
No, it's noon. It's noon.
Yeah. Of course, it like dies like right before you're about to do your session.
Yeah, so of course.
That's how things work. All right. Well, I'm gonna put myself backstage and be here if you need anything. And let's get to it.
All right. Thanks, Jen. Hello, everybody. So I did just kind of want to reiterate, and I've done this, a few times throughout KojiCon, and just say thanks to everybody at Yellow Farmhouse. Jen and her whole team have been absolutely excellent. Thank you to all of you who have come out for KojiCon. This response has been completely overwhelming, and it's just been absolutely fantastic to be on this journey with all of you. Especially people all over the world. It's just really, really fantastic. And then, to all our sponsors, to Fermentation School, to South River Miso, and definitely, personal one for me, Certified Angus Beef. They've got this restaurant challenge going on right now. This is a way to support local independent restaurants. So go to the restaurant, take a picture of the food you got, whether you're eating at home or eating there. Hopefully safely any way you do it, and post a picture to social media with the hashtag restaurant challenge. And you can be entered to win a $100 gift card. And then the restaurant themselves can be entered to win $2,500 to help out them and their employees. So it's a really awesome thing, and huge thanks to them for all their support. So some other ways, just really quick, you can support local restaurants, dining in, getting carry out, buying gift cards, tipping generously. Leave a positive comment either on social media or a review site, a 5-star rating, and then just simply thank the staff when you're there getting food. So those are all really, really important things right now. So I hope everybody's had an amazing 2 weeks. There's been so many mind-blowing presentations, and every one I'm like, oh, this is my favorite now. So it's been great seeing that. So all right. So we're going to get into some veggie charcuterie today. And before we kind of even look at anything or discuss these processes involved in them, I think it's really important to kind of just talk about charcuterie in general. Kind of what it is, how it evolved, and why we can turn something like this, as opposed to a cut of meat, into a piece of charcuterie, and it justifiably be called that. Because I think that's a huge part of this conversation. You know, do we call vegan cheeses cheese? Do we call vegetable-based charcuterie? And Rich and I present an argument in Koji Alchemy for that, and I'll get into it in just a sec. So I want to discuss these things first, and just kind of be able to go through them. And as you guys are making this food for people, whether you're serving it at a restaurant or home, like, you have this side of the conversation to be able to explain what it is and why it is. So this is very important. So charcuterie itself, as we apply the word nowadays, because the term from the French originally just applied to things like pâtés and terrines, these cooked, preserved, potted meats. So if we go back even farther than the evolution of French gastronomy, we understand that some of the earliest ways to serve meat were meats that were smoke dried. Some locales that were close to ocean fronts and saltwater could actually take advantage of that too. If you're drying meat over a smoky fire on a beach per se, and you have ocean spray coming up, and the water is kind of hitting the meat and drying on there, and the salt is landing on it and penetrating in. The most prevalent example we have of this is the production of salted cod up in the Nova Scotia area in New Brunswick in Canada, where they would simply just stake pieces of fish onto the beach side or onto the cliff side where lots of waves crashed and sprayed up, and it would salt, cure, and dry the meat at the same time, with the water and the wind acting naturally. You know, in more landlocked areas, the act of building a fire and setting long, thin strips of meat to hang a distance away from the heat, but still in full smoke, were great ways of preserving it. And as time went on, you know, people wanted a little bit more from the meat. Once we established that we could preserve it in a way that it would be shelf stable for very, very long periods of time, people wanted more out of it. And these techniques started to diversify. So originally, a lot of this smoke-dried meats or seafood that people would be eating were further used as something to be cooked. So they were preserved, and then they would kind of dice them up or mash them up and cook them in a pot of boiling water, you know, or stew them with some root vegetables or whatever they had on hand at the time. As things evolved, we started to realize that, you know, these foods could be delicious not cooked, and started to pursue methods of preservation for these meats that would allow us to eventually end up with things like prosciutto or, you know, air-dried duck out of the Asias and these sorts of things where they could be sliced thin and eaten raw per se. So charcuterie has bounced around, and one of the reasons we started to see this transformation, we believe, from taking this dried, cured product and cooking it to being able to eat it another way was the dried, cured product. If you were out on a hunting expedition or scouting out new land or exploring, whatever the case may be, it wasn't that pleasant. It was very tough to bite into, very hard to chew. You know, it would make you very thirsty when you ate it. So seeing some of these styles evolve into foods that we have nowadays, that in some aspects started out purely as a way to preserve, ended up putting the idea of pleasure in eating right up there with the importance of preserving it. And that's when the art of charcuterie really started to explode. And we have various things that people make. Actually, let me grab one example. sorry about my disappearing act, but various things like different types of pâtés that people would make. And these were ground meat preparations, heavily seasoned and spiced, mixed in with a few other ingredients like a slurry of eggs and flour and cream or fats. And these meats would stay much longer than other fresh cooked meats because of the preserving power of the salt and other things added to them. And they were delicious and they were relatively portable. So you could cook off a bunch of pâté and, it'd stay in a cooler environment for several days, whereas your meat may start to spoil in that time. So originally charcuterie, in terms of the French expression, started out referring to things exactly like this. As cuisines around the world moved and people traveled and we started to enjoy what everybody else around us was doing, we started ending up with a lot of these refined dry cured products, from different sausages and salamis through whole cuts of muscle, even whole back legs with the bones in them. So, there are a lot in the charcuterie community, a lot of purists that feel that outside of these salted and dried whole cuts of meat or sausages and these fresh ones, these pâtés and terrines, that is where the line is drawn for what can be considered charcuterie. So Rich and I discussed this heavily as we were writing Koji Alchemy. And, at the time I was working on developing a lot of these techniques with vegetables. And the conversation we started having was, is it really about the ingredients? Is it about what you are making something from versus the techniques and methodology applied to the creation of those foods? And when we started asking ourselves this question, and we started looking at all the different makes of charcuterie that we could find in various cultures, the common threads were the method and the technique, and not necessarily the substrate, not necessarily the animal they were being made from, or even how they were eaten, but the process involved in taking them from a raw state to this preserved state that was both pleasurable, delicious, and shelf stable. So we decided, for our purposes and for our intent, and for the explanation of these techniques and being able to actually put a name on them, because if you turn this into a piece of charcuterie and you put that on the menu, do you put salt cured, mold covered carrots in writing on the menu? Or do you say it's carrot charcuterie? How do you effectively communicate what this food is and what the intent of it is also? Because there's no masquerading these foods as anything other than they are. We are not trying to, turn these foods essentially into something that is unrecognizable. And we also want to maintain some sort of relatability to them. So when we communicate with someone who's going to eat them, or even work with them ourselves, we want this frame of reference that people are going to instantly click and understand some of what we've done. Even if these people aren't people that understand what goes into making charcuterie and the curing process and the drying and the inoculation and all of this stuff, even if they have no frame of reference for this, we want to be able to use something in the description of these foods that immediately transports somebody. And when you say carrot and charcuterie, that puts together something in somebody's mind or your own mind that gives you some sort of idea of what you're about to enjoy. If we said that it was a smoked, salt-cured, mold-inoculated, and dried carrot on the menu, yes, you could put that together, but your frame of reference for foods based on prior experience that you have through dining doesn't allow you to connect those dots to what the actual food is. So throughout this conversation, Rich and I decided that the word charcuterie could be aptly applied to these techniques and to these foods. And we felt it was really important to have these conversations too, because there are people out there making absolutely fantastic and thrilling things one of my favorites is Chef Justin Severino in Pittsburgh. He's had absolutely beautiful restaurants, and now I believe his main venture is called Salty Pork Bits. It's a charcuterie production company, and they use all sorts of local and heritage animals and make these beautiful charcuteries. But a number of years ago, I saw Justin doing amazing work with seafood and ending up with like swordfish bresaola, you know, and tuna salamis, hand-cut tuna bound together in a casing and hung and dried and sliced thin, just like a Toscano or sopressata would be. And if charcuterie could be applied to describe those, because the method and technique applied to them was the same as, you know, in the idea of the swordfish bresaola, the same as the eye of round cut off of beef. You know, why couldn't that apply to anything that was being put through these processes? So we thought that was really, really important to establish. And I definitely encourage all of you attending today, especially anybody that's working in a restaurant setting and producing these for diners, have this all be part of your conversation with food. And not just your diners too, but amongst your colleagues and your friends that make these foods. Maybe a lot of them are purists and very traditional and say, no, if it isn't done this way, it can't be called that. And open up this dialogue with them and say, well, then what would you call these things if they're being put through this exact methodology in the same process that you put? You could even essentially in a lot of these recipes, a lot of these foods use the same recipe you have for, you know, some sort of cured meat with these techniques. What would they call them? So, you know, Corey brings up an interesting point right here, asking, is this a symptom of the average person being further and further away from how their food is produced? And sure, I mean, that's a greatly complex issue. And hopefully a lot of the things that we've seen in so many of the other amazing presentations have kind of, whether they've discussed it individually or as an underlying kind of subconscious method of communicating with people, is really highlighting that and how far a lot of us have come, you know, from what our food is and what it started out as. Kind of behind me, it's hard to see, but right where my fingertip is, there's a dry ager cabinet with a whole goat hanging in it in the middle of my dining room. And believe you me, we get a lot of questions and a lot of looks from people who are terrified. Yet then they come and order, you know, a sandwich piled with lots of meat on it. So, you know, I think that disconnect is definitely real, and anything that any of us can do to kind of break that down and get people to understand the consequences of what they eat is really a win for everybody in all societies across the planet. So, now that we've kind of had this little intro discussion about charcuterie and, you know, some of these complex issues within the culinary world and what it is and how it should be called and what is, I'm going to actually just start diving into some of these techniques and how we can actually turn this, again, my beautiful trusty carrot, into this. And you can see here, this is a beautiful covered shriveled carrot. It's got some bend to it, some movement. It definitely won't snap if I bend it. It'll just keep going. And when we cut it open, I don't know, this computer won't reach down so far, so I'll cut some and then show you some slices and kind of how they behave. So here's you know, some of the cut face of this, and look at these slices. They got some wiggle and some movement to them, nice and thin. Oh, look at that! My daughter put stickers on my nails this morning, and I forgot to take them off. She's gotten me twice today. You know, and the bite on this is exceptional too. You eat it, and it has a little bit of the crunch of a vegetable still. That's unmistakable. It does definitely look like a carrot. That looks like a slice of carrot. You can see the core and the outer edge. But as I chew it and as it kind of sits in my mouth, all the method and technique that was put behind this really starts to shine. And what really stands out is the salting, the smoke, the spices that were applied onto it, the change in texture from it drying. And of course, the koji brings wonderful, wonderful after flavors. I mean, literally, it feels and tastes, I just swallowed it, like I just ate a piece of meat, yet that was a carrot in my mouth. There's no residual sweetness going in my mouth like I would expect with a carrot. No burst of water that you get as you masticate it in your mouth and you break it up. It really eats like a piece of cured meat. So I see somebody saying, yes, with beetroot, it is awesome. We've got some here. And we'll get into like the variety of things you can do with these techniques. But they're incredibly transformative. So it all starts with this. And you have to change the structure of this. This is with the first problem we encountered, was vegetables they're crisp. They're very firm. They aren't forgiving like meat is in terms of their texture. So what can be done to soften a vegetable? And the first thing is cooking it. So whenever we set out to make these different charcuteries, we set out to use regular cooking processes to help transform the texture of the vegetable. And if these cooking processes also are done at certain levels of heat or in certain environments, we can introduce Maillard reactions, which are extremely tasty, and caramelize our food and give it all these wonderful things. And then we can also introduce smoke while we're cooking to give things this classic grilled or smoked flavor that really comes with a lot of these different types of charcuterie. So simply put, you have to transform the texture. And we do different things for different vegetables. So in the case of the beets, the first thing that we do is we boil them. How long? Well, till they're done. They're all different sizes. So on average, I'd say we boil the beets. We put them in a pot of cold water, and we let them cook for 45 minutes or so, depending on the size, until they're knife or fork tender. After that, we peel the skins on them, we chill them down. And then for this technique, we do also smoke them. Now, for something like the carrots, I put them just right away into the smoker. And here's an example. It is sealed up in a bag, but you can see how dark these carrots are. They've been smoked. They haven't been cooked to the point where they're going to be mushed. So when we do smoke, we typically do at low temperatures, 170 to 200 degrees max. And about an hour at that temperature range seems to be really good for most vegetables. Now, it's interesting to note, those of you that have ever sous vide vegetables before, the structure of vegetables doesn't start to change till about 183 degrees Fahrenheit, I believe. Part of my lack of a conversion there. So as long as you're hovering around that temperature or slightly above, you're going to be able to change the structure of the vegetable into a texture that's going to be able to more mimic some of the qualities of these cured meats. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Once you start to go above 225 degrees, though, for prolonged periods of time, we do notice changes that result in the vegetables being more like a cooked vegetable than this zone for cooked meats. So thanks, Matthew, for posting that Celsius conversion there. It's about 85 Celsius. So different vegetables require different techniques because they're all different. And like I said, in the case of the beets, we boil them first before we smoke them at low temperature. And the smoking there is just to impart flavor. It isn't really to cook them further. The carrots, we go right into the smoker. In the summer, we do a lot of zucchini and yellow squash. And these are vegetables that have high moisture contents. And with those, we don't actually end up culturing them and growing the meat on the outside. What we end up doing is adding a salt cure and amazaki, or you could just use shio-koji to the vegetable and allowing it to cure this way. Whether you do this in plastic or you do it in a container where you can submerge them fully in a brine, either way works. And we find that works better with vegetables that have a softer texture and a higher moisture content. So as you're going around and kind of exploring with this, direct questions as to, is there one blanket thing to do for all of these? No, there isn't. It's going to depend on the vegetable, and it's also going to depend on what time of year the vegetable is being used. We have to often adapt our sauerkraut making here during the winter and spring before we start to get new cabbages in, because those cabbages were harvested in some cases 6 months prior and been in storage. And there's been some really interesting things happen to the water content in them, the texture of them, because the enzymatic changes as that vegetable is in dormancy or in slumber, from a metabolic standpoint, because it's been taken off its plant. So these are all kind of things that you have to look at with these. So I'm going to talk about the examples I have here, and then in the Slack channel, should you have any questions about other ingredients, other ways of approaching this, we can definitely dive in and explore there. So let's go back to the carrot. So as I said, we start off in the smoker, then we move to a curing phase. And this one we did put Umansky on, but the main thing is salt. And these vegetables are different from meats. So we tend to cure them at much lower salt percentages. Typically for whole muscle charcuterie or sausages, we do a minimum safe level of 3% salt during the curing process. And this is known as an equilibrium cure. We figure out the weight of what we're going to be curing. We calculate 3% of its weight, and we go ahead and let it sit on that cure till the salt equalizes throughout it evenly. With using 3% salt, it is a very safe level of salt for charcuterie and food production, but because of these vegetables and their high water content, it ends up being too salty for the vegetable charcuterie. So for the vegetable charcuterie, we typically drop it down to 1.75 to 2.25%, depending on what the vegetable is. And for each vegetable and for your personal palate, you're going to want to experiment. And the reason we can go down to these lower temperatures is during the curing process, the vegetable is held cold under refrigeration. It's either sealed up in a bag or a container. And the curing process on these, while for meats could be towards many months of salt curing, depending on how big a cut is. I know somebody years ago that made a beef steamship, which is the whole back leg of a cow. And that thing literally had to cure on salt for the better part of a year before they could even hang it. With these vegetables, this is a relatively quick process. So most of the time, these things aren't sitting around any longer than 7 to 10 days, which is pretty good for a vegetable, and definitely in a safe zone. I see Matthew asking if we can use an equilibrium brine. So we typically don't do a brine with this because we don't necessarily want to put moisture back into the vegetable. Whereas when you brine a turkey or a chicken breast or that sort of thing, it actually helps with water retention, believe it or not. Salt does get in and flavor the meat, but it also keeps the meat very juicy once it's cooked. So we're kind of going for the opposite thing. We want to draw moisture out of this and concentrate flavor. So we typically do just dry salt added to it. Now, if it looks really dry in there and after a day or so you don't notice salt pulling any moisture out of the vegetable, we have found it does help to add, a couple tablespoons of water or just a little bit of Umansky or something to help the salt move around the vegetables and be able to get to all parts of them evenly. So that is something you can do, but you don't want to do a full submerged brine. So as with this example with the Umansky, how much Umansky for this many carrots? Well, this is sealed in a vacuum bag. So we didn't have to use much. There's probably 4 ounces of Umansky here for about 5 pounds of carrots because the bag will hold a little bit nice and tight around here. So, a lot of these, like I said, there's so many kind of different avenues you can go for different vegetables that it can get infinitely complex. So, you know, coming back to the carrot, after it's been smoked and then cured, and minimum, we try to go 5 days on the cures for the vegetables. We find that's a minimum amount of time to get good salt penetration through most vegetables of various thicknesses. So after that, then it's time to inoculate them. And the majority of vegetables do not need anything more than your spore disbursement. Meaning you take one of these carrots, you put it in a bowl or a container, you sprinkle your spore disbursement on it so it's coated evenly, and then you go and you put in your incubation setup. Now, there are some examples that don't have enough starch in them and need a little help, and mushrooms are, and I'll show you something super cool in a moment with that. But when you go to incubate, we typically do these fish tubs that I showed everybody during the Umansky presentation that we use to grow koji in here. I put some resting racks in on the bottom. Now, these resting racks, you will lose a little bit of the mold coverage on the bottom when you pull them off. It'll happen. But if you have a resting rack that has greater spacing between the bars on it, or they even make ones that are like Teflon coated or non-stick, you could use those, chopsticks, that sort of thing, if you're concerned about losing a bit of the mold cap. But honestly, by the time this thing is shriveled and dried up, like this little bit on the bottom, you're cutting this thing so paper thin, it's really not going to matter so much. So, and in terms of growing the koji, you know, this ends up being a pretty quick process, not too different from growing, you know, on barley or rice or whatever you may be growing on. So generally, we typically see full bloom around 30 to 36 hours. So that's a full mold coat covering everything. And then I like to push it a little bit further. And you can see this has spored. So in this application, I wholeheartedly endorse and recommend letting it spore a little bit. Those kind of dank and musty and slightly acrid flavors that the spores carry lend really well to charcuterie. In a lot of ways, they kind of mimic the flavors and the aromas that a ham hanging in a curing room or a basement or a barn is going to pick up. You know, in the case of country hams where they hang them in barns. So letting the cultured vegetable spore is going to actually add to the flavor profile in a positive way in this circumstance. At least that's how I personally feel. So, you know, after you have your vegetables cultured, it's as simple as, and this is where you're probably going to need a dehydrator if you don't have one, because drying in the oven and that sort of thing, we just can't get good airflow and consistent temperature in an oven. So this is where a dehydrator really comes in. Or if you have a curing room where you're hanging other charcuterie, you can always tie these up and hang them in that environment also. It'll just be a bit slower. In the dehydrator, from fresh culture to this, depending on the size and what the vegetable is, you're looking at give or take 24 hours. Depending on what it is to get to this texture. And yes, you could go a little further or you could go a little less. It's really going to be up to you. And many times, you know, when I do a batch of carrots, I try to ensure that all these carrots are roughly the same size, but sometimes I end up with a little one and then a massive one, and I'm going to be creating this all at the same time. So it's really about working with these foods over time and understanding when I go to check them into the dehydrator, the little one may be ready, but the big one may need a little bit longer. So it's important to kind of be able to work hands-on with these things and judge that way. Overall, we're looking for a minimum of about 50 to 60% weight loss from the water coming out of here. So any less than that, and the texture still tends to be a bit like crispy, crunchy, juicy, more like a vegetable, and less like this, you know, kind of elasticy meat kind of texture to it. So, you know, and you can experiment. You may like it with a better bite. You may like it with this tougher dried bite. So as you go, you can look at them. Now, sometimes these dry out really, really, really far. I just forget about them, or someone left them uncovered in the deli case or that sort of thing. And then we have these intensely flavored vegetables that in many ways you can use like katsuobushi. If it gets like completely hard and dried, you can grate it, you can shred it. It's wonderful to finish different dishes with, grated over pasta. Let's say you're doing a winter squash risotto, right? We're just kind of finishing winter. Let's say you're cooking something like that, and you've got, some squash that you grew a mold on, and it's dried out fully. Go ahead, grate it on there as a great seasoning that's going to have like really cool cured squash flavor. So, ideally, these things, once they're held in a proper environment, and once they're made, we keep them in our refrigerated deli case. The high-end temperature range on that thing is 39 degrees. These will hold up in the deli case. They all end up selling before they'll even go bad, but shelf life on something like this is easily 6 weeks, if not longer. And that's ensuring that when you are keeping it cold, you kind of keep it loosely wrapped, so that any compressors or condensers in the fridge aren't blowing air on it and drying it out further. So, it's these have lots of applications. Here at Larder, in the summer when we're doing a huge variety and not necessarily just focusing on some of the root vegetables, we have a huge variety of vegetables that we're putting through these techniques. We often do like a vegan deli cold cut where we have all these different cured vegetables and we slice them thin, just like you go to the Italian market and you get the sandwich on some nice focaccia that's got salami and fettuccine on it and a little slice of prosciutto and some roasted red peppers and some herb sauce, and it's just this beautiful cold cut sandwich. We do the same thing with the vegetables too, and can offer a vegan version that's just as delightful as some of the others. So I do see a couple questions popping up here. I see some stuff about green coffee. I'm not going to get into that today, but definitely watch the conversation between Akiko Katayama and Koichi Higuchi, because it gets brought up. So dehydration temp for these, I keep it very, very low. I keep it at koji temperatures because oftentimes I'm dehydrating these at the same time I'm growing another batch of koji. So typically my dehydrator is set to 90. And the most important thing is this circulating air around them. So even at 90 degrees, these are ready to go in about a day and dry it out. So temperature isn't so important there as opposed to the circulating of the air. So when, and keep in mind when making these and culturing them, this disbursement, this is cut with starch and spores in here. So you shouldn't have to then, like after your cooked carrot, you shouldn't have to put more starch onto here. There should be enough in your disbursement and the vegetables should be good enough. Now, do we peel the vegetable? Do we not? With these carrots, and I'm going to grow mold on these carrots on Tuesday, I don't peel them. The outside's been smoked. That's where like all this great flavor is. Don't peel that off. There's no reason to. Something like the beets, the texture on that peel isn't so good. Or if you're attempting to do this with like eggplant or that sort of thing where there's a tough skin, go ahead, peel it, like try to eliminate some of that, and you'll end up with a nicer product. And it's just going to vary widely from vegetable to vegetable. But generally, these aren't getting peeled. So same process is applied to fruits too. In the fall, with new harvest apples, we use this technique a lot, and it creates some really interesting like chewy fruit and fruit leathers that we can then serve with the charcuterie boards and that sort of thing. So yes, it does work. Just choose firmer fruits. So apples are a stunner, and you can also incorporate this technique, and I'll kind of get into it because I see we're getting close on time, but you can make things like this. So these are maitake mushrooms, and I'll unwrap them here. So these were the shelves behind me, some of the canned ones that we put up in the fall. So they were cooked that way one time. And then I took them out of the cans. I cured them with salt, and these I did 1.75%. You can see it's pretty nice loaf here. See if I can get a cross cut. Oh yeah, look at that. That's pretty sweet, huh? And parts of it will be a little bit loose. Originally, I started messing around with this technique, trying to replicate salamis, and really getting it perfected has been very difficult. And the reason for that is the mushrooms need some help. So in this instance, I do use cornstarch to further dust the mushrooms because they're so wet and they don't have a lot of amylose or amylopectin in them for the mold to grab hold. I add a little cornstarch, and because of that, if I were to dry this in the dehydrator so that I could slice it like a salami, it ends up being dusty and brittle where all the mycelium has joined. And I haven't found a technique yet for infusing that mycelial and starch layer with the same amount of moisture that the mushrooms have and allowing it to dry properly where that you could slice it and it not crumble apart. That being said, this we will be featuring on a veggie burger or a vegetarian or vegan sandwich where we cut steaks out of this. You can pan sear them. You can roast them. You could roast the whole log, you know, and then carve it table side. But, you know, these will be seared off or even deep fried is really, really good for this. And then, you know, put it on a great sandwich or serve it on the charcuterie board. So how did I get this log? So I started off, I dusted the mushrooms in a little bit of cornstarch and spores. I let them grow flat and even on the tray for about the first 24 hours. And at that 24-hour mark, they're knitted together fairly well. So then I take them, I roll them up, or sometimes I break them apart completely, put them on plastic wrap, or you could put them into like a loaf pan or that sort of thing, especially one that has perforations in the bottom. I tend to use plastic wrap for it. I roll it up tight and torque it up, and then I poke a bunch of holes in it and let it finish growing for the next 12 to even 20 hours, and it'll all knit together in that shape. You don't have to roll it up. What you could do once you have that first flat layer of growth and you notice the mycelium developing, you could cut it into little blocks and stack them on top of each other and then let them finish growing together, which they will. Don't get too high because then the temperature in the center of them, if you're doing blocks, will get too hot and you could kill off the mold before it really knits together and it could potentially spoil. You know, so you'll need to experiment. Typically, if I have a layer about yay thick, let's say 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick of the mushrooms growing flat, I won't bring it any more than like 1.5 inches thick before I notice problems with it growing in the center. So all different sets of spores work for this. High protease producers are more of your friend because they are going to work with any residual proteins in these vegetables, which there are microscopic amounts in them. And they are going to help you create more of these umami and savory meat-like flavors versus using some of the higher amylase producing strains, which can introduce, you know, raw sugars to this process. And that can definitely change things from a textural standpoint. And also a flavor standpoint in a way that we don't necessarily find appealing. So let's see here. It definitely does look like tempeh. And for those of you that source spores from Higuchi Metsu no Soken Shoten, Koichi Higuchi's company, he has a strain called Hashimoto, which is an Aspergillus oryzae for growing on beans. It's a variant bred for growing on beans and legumes. And I find more success with that than I do the tempeh molds for actually producing tempeh-like products. So if you can source that from him, you'll get some really, really cool stuff. I see Ludger sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, is asking, if you use shio koji for curing, do you add extra salt then, or just the shio koji? Well, so this is why I use amazake, because then I have full control over the amount of salt going in there. So if you use shio koji, try to figure out what percentage of salt you put in there, and try to figure out what percentage of salt will pass on to the vegetable. You might have to start at a much higher salt concentration. So those are things to keep in mind. And that's why I use the amazake versus shio koji for this application. You could very well use shio koji and have awesome, awesome things come out. We've done, because we're more amazake driven than shio koji driven here, we've actually let some of these vegetables sit in sour amazake and then salt them so that we can get some of these fermented meat flavors like you're used to getting in like summer sausage and salamis, and get a little bit of lactic tang on them first. So there are many, many different variants and many different things you can attempt. Let's see here. And any of the kojis work. Like I've used kojis for beans with these techniques. I've used Aspergillus luchensis with this, and it's worked. I don't like the tang that the things get, but so any of the kojis should work for this. It's just a matter of dialing in what characteristics you want. Do you want more of this umami flavor to develop? Do you want more sugars to develop? Do you want that citric acid tang? These are questions for you to kind of look at as you're making these things. Stan asked, would a tempeh starter make more sense in these cases of chopped material in need of binding? Yes, in a lot of ways, but like I said, the Hashimoto strain that I use from Koichi Higuchi at Higuchi Metsu no Soken Shoten binds just as good or better than any than Rhizopus obliosporus or Oreze. So I tend to use that instead, especially because if I let the grow go a little too long, I don't get those ammonia bursts that are brought on from bacterial contamination with the tempeh process. So so I had a couple other things I wanted to show you guys. So we've been messing around with pumpkin for a while. Here's an example where I stacked 2 layers and let them grow together. And you can see they're stuck together. The mold held them together. They've grown together. This is good sliced thin, but I enjoy this griddled the best. Seared on both sides, and then it's awesome on like a breakfast sandwich with some cheese and egg. It's really, really delicious. I know putting egg and cheese on something that's gearing towards vegan isn't ideal, but it really, really works that way. So, and it hits on all the processes, on all the satiation that breakfast sausage would bring to the party, which kind of leads us to spices and seasonings and this sort of thing. What about different binders? And I see a question here from Nicole. Is it possible to use a binder after incubating like transglutaminase or to roll and hang? And yes, it is possible. Ideally, you want to use the mold to do as much of the binding as possible. Using transglutaminase, I've never used with this process because all transglutaminase is animal derived. Those of you that don't know what transglutaminase is, it's often referred to as meat glue. It's an enzymatic protein set. It's often in a powder, but you can find it in a slurry, and you literally sprinkle it on a piece of meat, put another piece of meat on it, let it sit for a day, and it will literally cause any residual loose proteins in those meats to bind together and stick together in a way that, if cooked properly, you wouldn't be able to tell it was 2 pieces of muscle glued together versus 1 piece of muscle. So I've never really used it with these techniques. Feel free to go ahead and experiment and see what you come out with. So Shalom and Quinn questions in similar frames of using traditional molds used for salamis like Penicillium algiavensis to kind of give some of those dank you know, salami, charcuterie flavors that these molds bring to the production of those. And yes, we've done that. It works great. But, you know, focus here is koji. And it creates, like I said, when we allow these to go to spore, we get a lot of those similar flavors that we find in penicillin algiavensis and other molds used in salami production. So it's kind of like a, you know, all-purpose one-go thing. I see a question here about, instead of using plastic wrap, could you use cloth, such as cheesecloth or that sort of thing? Yeah, cloth definitely works. Yes, you'll get better aeration. The problem with cloth on this is because you're wrapping it so tight around like these mushrooms to form them, if it isn't a very tightly woven cloth and isn't lint free, you're going to get pieces of microscopic pieces of cloth stuck into the mycelial network. And then you're going to have like all these little bits of hair from the cloth on your charcuterie. So plastic does tend to be better. Like I said, if you use a mold pan, like a pan to hold these in, and you can get mold pans that are all different shapes and sizes, and you can even find perforated ones, those are ideal. Or make your own perforated ones. Go to the dollar store and get some small little baking pans and drill some holes in them and that sort of thing. And it should work really, really well for you. So after something like the mushrooms is rolled in the plastic wrap, it still sits in the koji growing environment. There's enough moisture, and with the plastic, that drying out isn't going to be an issue. I mean, you'll have a couple spots. You can see a few here by my fingers where, yeah, the holes were poked and it definitely dried out a little bit. But overall, you won't have any issues. So you keep it in there for, you know, the final 12 hours of the grow roughly, and you'll have a nice nice thing for you. So trying to see if we've got some more questions. Oh, you know, the other thing to point out too is duchi. After it's been aged for a considerable amount of time, and these are almost 3 years old, these have been vacuum sealed and smashed together, and these hold together very, very firmly. We'll even cut thin slices of these duchi cakes, and it ends up being like a really cool kind of like charcuterie bite that you can have. And kind of one other thing I wanted to get into, just to kind of get your brain stirring, and I know we had whole lectures and sessions about amino sauces and this sort of thing, but this is a new one we've been working on for a while, and Rich got me hip to hemp protein powder, having this very aqueous kind of taste and flavor to it, very seaweed-esque. So we made an amino sauce with the cooking liquid left from blanching our chanterelles before we canned them. That was the base liquid. Old Latiparus sulphurus, which is the chicken of the woods mushroom that was slightly buggy, and the hemp protein powder, and made an amino sauce. And between the mushroom gnat larvae that were in the mushroom and the hemp protein powder, we have a vegan fish sauce that this tastes and smells like fermented shrimp paste, but it's much milder and so overpowering. You could use it as a like seasoning. So even from some aminos, use the combinations and right types of proteins, you can develop flavor compounds that are associated with either oceanic or terrestrial proteins. And this you can use to your advantage. We can use this in the curing process, some of these vegetables, when they're under salt and before culturing and drying, and infuse even more flavor into them. So there, you know, there's a lot that you can do with that. And is it vegan if it has bugs? We didn't per se add the bugs to them. It just happened to be a mushroom that had been buggy. By the time we got around to using them, they had been dehydrated and whatnot. Most of the bugs had left and fallen out. So is it truly vegan? I'm not sure. But, you know, we totally disclose that to people. So when they're getting it. You know, once again, a question: how long does vegetable charcuterie keep in your fridge? Once it is, like, you know, fully dried out, inoculated, and ready to go, like I said, this can hold up 6 to 8 weeks. It just depends on how you store it. So we typically store them in loosely closed containers, whether with the lid just slightly open or just loosely wrapped in plastic wrap, not very tight, so that there is some airflow around them. They hold up beautifully. So, which is great to be able to, have a beet sit around that's been cooked for 6 weeks and it still be delicious and safe to eat is absolutely fantastic. So Maria asked a really, really important question. At what point would you add herbs and spices? So most of the time we do it during the curing process. And this is really important for helping to create some of these really good charcuterie flavors. These carrots we do with pastrami spice. So it's the spice mix we use to make our pastrami cured brisket that's eaten here. So we put the spices in when it's curing with the salt and or if you're adding amazaki, and they really infuse heavily. As long as the spices are on before you grow the mold on them, you shouldn't have any issue. And things like smoked paprika, smoked dried seaweed, anything that's got like these great earthy flavors like juniper and black pepper, add wonderfully to these. And you can borrow from any traditional charcuterie preparations, like I said, with the pastrami spice on the carrots. Sometimes we like to use a lot of smoked paprika and garlic on some things if we're looking for more of a Gallican profile on them when we're making the charcuterie. And it comes through great. And when you put the spices in, how much do you use, whatever, I mean, it's highly variable. It's how much do you like the spices. So typically for, there's about 5 pounds of carrots here. I would add, I don't know, a 1/4 cup of pastrami spice to this when I was curing it. But it's up to you. If you like more, go for more. If you like less, go for less. One thing to note, though, is with all the spices in here and them being stuck to the carrots, I do gently brush the spice mixtures off of them after they've come out of the cure, because the mold will adhere and grow into and on the vegetable better if those spices are not there. So you're purely using those spices as like an infusion, essentially. And whatever you want to use, go ahead and use it. Are there any spices that could inhibit koji growth? To date, we really haven't found anything. What the issue is, if the spice is between the vegetable and the mycelial mat that's forming, the spice can kind of fall off and break off the mold covering, and that's the issue there, because it's blocking and it's preventing the mold from actually growing into the vegetable, and that's why I do rub them off. You can rinse them off too. So. Let's see. Shalom, I like your question. How do you know which bugs you can use? Yeah, I mean, that's a crapshoot. But if you do want to use insects in some of these processes or start making different amino pastes and sauces out of insects, which here we do use crickets, we do use mealworms, and when the cicada come out, as they are one of the 17-year broads is going to be coming out about 2 hours south of me this summer, we gather tons of those, and we make amino paste and amino sauces out of them, and they're absolutely delicious. So there's a lot of existing literature out there about emilphagy and eating insects. So it's very easy to find out which ones are safe to eat and which ones are not. But definitely do not just go out there and pick up random insects and decide that you're going to use them in these processes. In the case of the mushrooms and the wild mushrooms, many years of foraging has taught us that, if there's a little worm trail here or there inside a fungus, and then we cook them first and then we put them through these other processes, we've never had any issues with that. So, and find me a wild mushroom that doesn't have worm trails and that, people have eaten, go for it. It doesn't really exist. So, Corey brings up humidity. So, in this grow setup, If you think you're going to have issues of humidity, you can add a little bit of water, a couple tablespoons to the bottom that sits underneath the trays before you wrap this in plastic. But honestly, there's enough moisture in these vegetables that just by closing off the container and just allowing enough space for air to flow just a little bit, by poking holes in, there's enough moisture, and I've never had issues with maintaining enough humidity for the mold to grow on these charcuterie. So I'm just looking for some more questions here. Yeah, Shalom, use bee larvae. That's totally cool. I recommend mason bees versus honeybees. Their populations aren't crashing, so that's definitely a good one to use. So, yeah, I think that's about what we've got on vegetable charcuterie. I've got a little bit more time wiggle room. Jen, I'm not sure how you are, but if we just want to take a few more minutes just to see if any more questions come in, that's
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I have a couple here. I can post them up if that works.
Yeah, totally.
So here's one about roasted barley salted koji as cured for your vegetable charcuteries.
That I haven't done, but I'm sure it would work in some way. As long as things are palatable, meaning like we can eat them with no discomfort, and they are delicious and they're pleasurable, and they're safe. That's always really, really important, is, using good food safety techniques with these. I don't see why you couldn't do that.
Great. And then there's a couple people who are asking about home smoking tips.
Home smoking tips. Oh, gosh. I would definitely search some DIY websites and see what some people have designed. I'm really fortunate here at the restaurant that we have a huge China box called a hanging oven smoker that we use. And at my house, I have an offset smoker if I'm doing things there that I use. So I've done things with the smoking gun before, which is an awesome little piece of technology. That does work. The smoke doesn't penetrate as deeply and isn't as front and center as with other techniques, but that's probably, I think, the best option for home cooks, instead of messing around and like building something that you're gonna put on top of your oven and smoke in the house. And there's a lot, really shouldn't smoke inside. But with the smoking gun, you can, because it's very controlled. So, and you can get different smoking guns from different manufacturers for as little as $20 now. So something like that is a worthwhile investment for that.
That's a good tip.
Yeah.
Here's a question about, can you use koji flour plus salt to cure? Will the enzymes work on the vegetables?
They should. I've never gone that route because I always have spores on hand, and that's in the spirit of this whole convention and what Rich and I put into Koji Alchemy. It's about working with koji from the ground up. So, but if you have some dried koji flour, as long as you dried it in a way that didn't knock out the enzymes, or if you wanted to use miso paste for this, you totally could. And kind of going back to discussing some of these vegetables with higher water content that we get in the summer, like yellow squash and zucchini, those we don't end up growing the mold on them at all. We just let them sit in like an Umansky and salt cure, and then we slow dry them, and then we slice them thin. Because those with that higher mold content, or the higher water content, it's much harder to get a good mold growth on there. And we noticed that some of them would spoil before that would happen. So just, bathing it in shio koji or Umansky for a little bit and curing it that way and then drying will allow you to get some fantastic things. So I don't see why you couldn't use dried ground koji in that application. So.
Great. I think this may be the end of the questions. I have a question about the katsubushi, and Clara was also asking what vegetable has had the best success. So this is just if you could talk more about the specifics.
Yeah. So, I think one of our favorites with the vegetable katsubushi would probably have to be celery root or celeriac. The same thing, two different words. Celery itself is high in nitrites and nitrates, and is used in uncured charcuterie. They use celery powder or celery juice. And some of what that brings to the table, along with the flavor of celery, works really good for stuff that you're going to dry out completely and really, really bring some bold, concentrated, full-bodied umami to things. So for the katsuobushi, I definitely like celery root. It's excellent. So it does help to cut it into smaller, manageable pieces, because waiting for that whole root to shrink up to something that's rock hard can take a while. So halve it or quarter it, and you'll get it done a lot faster.
That makes sense. And then let's end on this question here, which I think is a great one. What are you most curious about and trying to do next?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I'm looking into some bigger picture things right now, with the coffee and chocolate industries, and also with the cheese making industries, about how to get these enzymatic sets that koji produces into some of those processes, especially with coffee and chocolate. We feel that there's a lot of wasted product from going from berry or mucusy bean, depending on which one, to the final product. And there's a lot of food value in the pulps and some of the things left over through these fermentation processes. So we feel that enzymatic sets could greatly allow us to be able to control some of that food waste and even create value-added products like really cool alcohols and liqueurs that could be salvaged and create more value for the people producing, and not just the coffee and chocolate as a plant, as a ingredient, but also the people then turning them into their respective end product. Yeah. So those are some of the things that we've been looking at for a while, and it takes a long time to develop relationships with a cacao grower in Ecuador, and be like, hey, we think these awesome things could happen. So it takes a lot of time to build those relationships, and we're finally getting to the point with some of them that we're ready to start looking at some really, really cool transformative things for those larger industries. So that's an off-world exploration.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. Well, this again was unbelievable. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day. I hope it's a lot calmer, and love the on your fingers. That was fun. All right, take care, everybody.
Yeah, take care. Thank you so much. And, we can definitely continue this conversation in the Slack. So
sounds great. All right, take care. Bye.